the TMZ Behind the Bar podcast with the TMZ lawyers, Jason Beckerman and Derek Kaufman.
Welcome, everybody, to the Behind the Bar podcast. We are going to talk sexual assault today. Not our favorite topic.
I shouldn't express excitement when you say sexual assault.
But a fascinating topic. In the last 2 weeks, we've had 2 to 3 weeks, we have two really interesting potential sexual assaults involving world-famous people. Ezekiel Elliot, the Cowboy star running back, and Cuba Gooding Jr., the obviously famous actor, both of whom did almost the identical thing, which is they pulled on a woman's clothing.
Yep.
And in doing so, exposed the woman's private bits to
I haven't heard them called lady bits in so long.
I said private bits.
Yes.
To the public. The first case, Ezekiel Elliot, he was on Bourbon Street during a Mardi Gras festival, and he pulled a woman's top off, exposing her breast to all the gatherers.
Yeah, they're screaming over a balcony. This is as raucous an event as you can get. And he took liberties and pulled off her shirt.
Pulled off her top.
Just exposed one boob.
Justin Timberlake style with Janet Jackson.
A little Janet Jackson, shades of it.
And then in the second, it's funny, in thinking about this, I never thought about that Janet Jackson until this very moment.
Yeah.
The similarities. Yeah. And then Cuba Gooding Jr., I don't know what it is. Anyway, he was at a Pally House event with Sarah Paulson, his co-star in the O.J. Simpson show that they did together. And as Sarah Paulson, she was wearing this incredibly high slit dress.
Yes, long dress, but with a long slit all the way up to her waist, basically.
Looked like I almost, putting aside the legal merits of it all, but Ezekiel Elliot, like, it was kind of in the moment at Bourbon Street. Cuba Gooding Jr., this very weird thing, kind of reaches out and yanks on Sarah Paulson's dress.
Yeah, because Paley Fest is like where they do, it's like a big conference, right? They're sitting up there on a panel,
they're
answering questions.
Trying to sell television shows.
A little more cerebral than Mardi Gras.
Right, he pulls her, and she's the slit is high, and then the slit, because he pulled it, and he didn't intentionally. It wasn't like, I'm just like looking to grab her to get her attention. He intentionally pulled on her dress, and it caused the slit to go up to, once again, her private bits.
Yeah, there was something a bit cavemanish about it. She's walking by, he sees a high slit, and it was as if the reptilian part of his brain took over, and he grabbed for it.
He couldn't help himself. So in both of these cases, there's been a lot of talk about sexual assault, and what is it, and we're going to get into that in just a second. But Derek, before that, it occurred to me as we were preparing for the podcast, it's kind of amazing that in 2017, how far we've come in having these conversations. I mean,
we're almost a century from Fatty Arbuckle. I mean, the original silent era rapist.
And since Fatty Arbuckle and others, there have been countless big time celebrities who have either been accused of child rape, sexual assault, or have even been convicted of these crimes, and they have come back, and they've really survived and thrived.
Flourished,
not since then. I mean, just the accusers. Woody Allen, Errol Flynn was accused of sleeping with the underage girl. Kobe Bryant, obviously, convicted. You have Mike Tyson, Marv Albert, Roman Polanski, and all 6 of these people, and countless others, have come back and had very successful careers, notwithstanding these allegations. But here we are in 2017, and big time celebrities are really being called to the carpet for not casting aspersions on what they did, and maybe it was awful. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Sure.
But really taking some heat for potential crimes that are far less serious than what these other big-time celebrities.
And it's fascinating. Some of these stories of redemption over time, you think, well, they just did other work. They created another narrative. But Mike Tyson was basically, who is now like a guy who goes out and does one-man shows. He's not even fighting anymore, and he's survived a rape conviction.
Roman Polanski has been in exile for the last 40 years, and he is still lauded in exile, notwithstanding the fact that he's only done a couple of movies since. So it really is incredible. As I was looking at this, I don't know if you remember. Do you remember that Britney Spears was accused of a sex crime?
No.
In 2012.
I did not remember this.
Yeah, a bodyguard of hers accused her of flashing herself to him and then dropping her robe and saying, come into the bedroom, and sort of he felt that his job was on the line if he didn't do it.
Wow.
And so subsequently, I don't remember if he quit or was let go. I don't remember what happened, but he accused her. He brought these crimes to light and said that he was basically the victim of a sort of quid pro quo kind of sex offense.
Wow.
Yeah, 2012.
Well, while we're on memory lane, it comes to mind Elton John.
Not Fatty Arbuckle again.
No, not that far back. But Elton John feted for his 70th birthday. It was a big story yesterday. He was also accused. We did a lawsuit where I believe a driver of his said he was sexually assaulting him and said, pull your todger out, which we had never heard that term. It's such a British term for, I believe, wiener.
Yeah. If it's not wiener, if it's
not wiener, maybe it's not
your
harassment.
wallet out and show me your driver's license, that would not be quite as bad. Well, no, that was much like the John Travolta accusations. Again, a lot of these never improved. We want to be clear about that. Elton John denied it, and the charges were dropped. John Travolta, nothing ever came to light. Woody Allen, obviously. obviously, and who are the others? Errol Flynn, Kobe Bryant. No proof of anything.
Sure.
But they were accused of these crimes, and their careers took hits in the short term. Not Britney Spears, not
Elton John.
Not Elton John. But the others, their careers took hit in the short term. Long term, though, no ramifications. But here we are, 2017, Ezekiel, Elliot, and Cuba. And my question for you is,
yes,
what is sexual assault?
So sexual assault, let's break it down, because this is a crime or a civil action that you can bring against someone, and there are elements that you have to prove. Okay, so first, you got to prove intent. It has to be that you intend to cause something harmful or offensive about your contact with a sexual organ or a sexual part of the body. You got to grab a boob. You got to do something along those lines. You have to mean to do it.
And it sort of speaks for itself, what is offensive conduct, right? I mean, just touching someone's shoulder to grab their attention, not offensive, but exposing their breast, exposing their genitalia, or touching a part of their body certainly would qualify to satisfy that first element.
Right, but intent really matters here, because if I'm running to the bathroom and I stop short and I have my hands up and I don't intend to grab someone, that's not intent. That's not sexual assault. That's an accident. So that's the first. That's the first one. It always reminds me of the Simpsons moment where Bart and Lisa are fighting, and he says, "I'm not hitting you. I'm just waving my arms around, and if you come into my direction, you may get hit." And I always love that, because it's a commentary on intent. Anyway, the second element is the person, and I want to listen to this carefully, did not consent to the act. It is a past tense. They didn't consent to the act. And the third one is, was the person harmed by it? So let's go to the harm aspect.
Yeah.
Harm is pretty easy to prove, right? At least a person could say, like, I was embarrassed. That's emotional harm, things like that.
Right.
I was actually
and there's a sort of famous line that everybody learns in law school, and it really does, come up in real life all the time, which is this old: you take the victim as you find them. So the idea
call that
is
the eggshell plaintiff,
right? The idea is if you cold cock somebody, punch them in the face, what you didn't know is that they had a previous skull fracture, and therefore their skull collapses. You can't say, well, I didn't mean to kill them. I just meant to punch them. No, you take your victim as you find them. So if somebody does have that pre-existing skull fracture, I can't come up with a better example.
Sure, or if they have a thin skull,
which therefore causes the person to die, you can be convicted of second-degree murder, even though that punch wouldn't have killed a normal person. It killed that person because you take your victim as you find them. So if you sexually assault a person who is particularly, susceptible to kind of damages as a result of that, you take that person as you find them. If you cause injury, it doesn't matter that your conduct shouldn't have necessarily caused that. It just matters that it did cause it.
That's right. That's right. You take your victim as they come. Caveat actor, I guess you might say, something like that.
You might say.
I was trying to come up with something, but it didn't work
Coin
quite.
a Latin phrase.
The last one is what we need to pause on, though, because this is the most important. Did the person who was groped or what have you consent to the act? And what's important here is that it's past tense, right? So did they consent at the time of the act?
And one similarity between both the Ezekiel Elliot and the Cuba Gooding Jr. Events, in the instant after the event took place, and you can see this in the videos if you watch the two videos, and I know they're running on YouTube right now, but in the first instance, Ezekiel Elliot pulls the woman's top off, and she smiles and laughs and immediately clutches to cover herself up. In the Cuba Gooding Sarah Paulson incident, she laughs and turns around with kind of a smile on her face. But if either of these guys were to be prosecuted, and Ezekiel Elliot might actually be prosecuted for this. I don't think we've gotten the final word. Cuba, I'm doubting.
It would be very unlikely,
very difficult. But the fact that they turned and smiled at them or whatever in the first instance, I don't think that necessarily they would use it as a defense, but I don't think that really tells you anything.
I agree with that. That doesn't undo. Neither of these guys said, "Hey, Sarah," or "Hey, woman in the Mardi Gras crowd, I'm going to pull your top or I'm going to grab your dress," and ask them permission. They just did these acts. At least that's the way it looks to us. These are videos, and so you need that consent at the time of it. After the fact, consent doesn't really work because the offense has already been committed. What it does have is a practical impact, right? Because in order to prosecute these cases, you need to have usually a willing victim, someone who's going to get on the stand and testify that they were emotionally traumatized by this. They never gave consent. Ezekiel just groped me in public, and I suffered horrific injuries. Without that, where's their case?
Well, it can be. Obviously, prosecutors aren't necessarily beholden to the victims to tell their story. You see this all the time in domestic abuse cases, right? A husband beats his wife. The wife is unwilling to press charges against the husband. But prosecutors will go forward anyways because they understand the reality of the situation, that a woman or if the shoe's on the other foot, a man might be susceptible to pressure from their spouse to not bring the crime. And the crime is not, it's a myth. When you have criminal prosecution, the crime is not against the victim. The crime is against the state. That is why in our society, the state prosecutes individuals. Anybody who commits a crime, they're committing a crime against us all. That's the sort of the guise of the law that we work under, and therefore the state has the right to bring prosecution. But it would be an interesting thing to do in this case. I think Derek and I are in accord on this. You want to talk a little bit about that?
So wait, before we leave the topic of consent, I want to talk about one more thing. What does the context matter here? So in our two instances, we have one raucous Mardi Gras event where they're on a balcony, people throw beads if you flash them. That's the type of environment, versus we are at a relatively staid function in Paley Fest. Does that matter at all if we're sort of reading tea leaves and don't have someone who says, yes, do this to me? Because you rarely have actual consent.
I think it really could. And the Mardi Gras example is a perfect one to sort of get the most extreme example of that. And obviously, we didn't see any evidence of this, but let's say there was evidence. There's obviously a ton of videos going crazy, especially when Ezekiel Elliott's up on a balcony. At Mardi Gras, it's often the case that women will flash their breasts for beads. That's what happens at Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Women show their breasts, guys throw beads.
Usually they decide to show their breasts.
They decide.
Just to be very clear.
If 2 minutes earlier and 20 minutes earlier and 2 hours earlier for the last 2 hours, this woman had been showing her breast to every passerby, I think it would be more difficult to say that she didn't consent to Ezekiel Elliott exposing her breasts. Even though I could see the argument.
Yeah, it's a delicate
I think
dance.
It would be very difficult to her to say that she was really harmed by the exposure of her breasts to people on the street in Bourbon Street.
I think you're right.
Because how are you going to show that when you've been doing it? Sarah Paulson's a totally different story, right? It's sure the slit in her dress is high, but she is fully covered. And for him to do what he did and really expose her to a group of people who are her peers and others in the industry whose opinion mean a lot to her, and she necessarily needs them for a career, that was, I really thought, shameful what Cuba Gooding Jr. did. Not to get too opinionated about it, but that's what I thought.
But these are always difficult conversations to have, because even the woman in the Mardi Gras event, you don't want a situation where a woman goes to a club in a short dress and she has it coming, right? That's not what Jason is saying. Jason is saying contextually, though, you have to look at the entire instance. If she pulls up her shirt multiple times, is the time that Ezekiel did it, yes, it's bad, but it is less bad.
Again,
right?
she has to show harm, that she was embarrassed in some way or something like that. And if she had showed her own breasts a number of times in the media to the exact same number of people in the exact same scenario, it'd be difficult. But again, there's no evidence she did that.
Right.
For all we know, she was completely clothed and is a kind of person that would find it mortifying to be exposed to the public. In that case, you do have harm, and he could and maybe even should be prosecuted, to be honest with you.
Now, I want to ask you, Jason, so we have two people here that we don't seem to have clear consent in either scenario, but we may not have willing victims who want to actually prosecute this. Should we throw the book at them anyway? We've got two videos. Prosecutors can go on the video alone. They don't need to have anyone on the stand. They can say, look at this instance. There was no consent given. Throw the book at these guys to really send a message that we punish sexual assault.
You know what this is to me? You know, I see the attraction of that sort of an argument, but really it's very paternalistic to say that. It's very paternalistic to say a woman is incapable of pursuing her own claim if she doesn't, you know, if she's choosing not to, it's because she doesn't quite know enough, and the state needs to get involved and go after it. Now, it's a little different.
These aren't damsels in distress
right.
anymore. We don't live in that society.
Which is very different than the situation involving a husband and a wife, because there you do have duress. This is a damsel in distress situation. Right. But here, this is a free woman. If she wants to go and bring the claim and go and testify against Ezekiel Elliott, she can. Mm-hmm. And this idea that the state should somehow jump in and protect these young ladies, that's nonsense to me.
I tend to agree. I think the role of the state is to protect vulnerable populations. I think of the disabled and children as being people that you definitely protect. When there's a child victim or someone, there's elder abuse, things that are really vulnerable segments of the population, but women are not just a vulnerable segment of the population anymore.
Can be. All people can be.
Situations.
Battered spouse syndrome is a real syndrome, and women suffer from that. Traditionally, women suffer from that with regularity.
It's not only women, Jason.
I said usually. It can be men as well. There are allegations against Liza Minnelli for battered spouse syndrome. But in that kind of case, you do have somebody who is in a weakened state and may not be able to make decisions on their own under threat of violence. That's not the case here. This woman has every right to go and press charges if she wants to. The prosecutor can then decide whether or not to bring those charges, but she has every right to go forward. And just because she hasn't done so doesn't mean that, big bad state should step in and do it for her. for her.
I couldn't agree more, and I think of Sarah Paulson as even stronger in this. Sarah Paulson is a proud actress who has been in the industry a long time. She can stand up for herself. If she really believes that Cuba Gooding Jr. crossed the line in this instance, she would press that case, and then I would look at it an entirely different way.
Dude, who's a bigger star, Sarah Paulson or Cuba Gooding Jr.?
Or the woman on the Mardi Gras balcony?
No, he has an Academy Award, which sort of gives him the leg up.
Yeah,
pardon the pun. In this
she's
situation.
hotter now, though.
But she's definitely better looking.
Yeah,
but
there's more heat behind her. Yeah,
she's kind of a big thing now. I still think he's a bigger star though.
Yeah, I think he's one of those guys who's just iconic.
He did radio for God's sake.
He did radio. He's got Jerry Maguire under his belt. She doesn't have that big iconic moment, but her Marcia Clark was incredible.
Yeah, she's a much better actor. That's almost certain. Isn't it?
Yeah, who knows? Let's do some mail time.
All right, mail time. Remember to write in your questions and comments to behindthebar@tmz.com. First one up is from Jude. I like the video you made on PewDiePie not being able to sue the Wall Street Journal for defamation. I would, however, like to know if PewDiePie could instead sue for false light in the state of New York, where the Wall Street Journal's headquarters are located.
That is a great question. So we didn't analyze false light last time. We analyzed defamation because that was the allegation that was sort of being tossed around by the PewDiePie sort of contingent.
Right.
But I think there might, I'm not sure New York really has a good, robust false light statute, but the claim wouldn't necessarily have to be brought in New York. PewDiePie, as a foreign resident, could probably bring it anywhere.
Right.
Including in his own country, actually.
Yeah, and false light's a little different. I mean,
false light is a little different than
similar.
defamation. So what's your take? Does PewDiePie have a good claim against the Journal for false light?
I think he's got a better false light claim than he has a defamation claim, because remember, defamation is about a reputational harm from a false statement. Nothing false was said about PewDiePie. The video was shown, and he hired some people to hold up a sign that said, maybe he hired them. They were on his show.
And we took a lot of heat from the PewDiePie folks after our last podcast, where we talked about the fact that he could not bring a defamation claim. And we stand by that. But that doesn't mean there's not another claim he could bring. And I think false light might be the claim.
I think false light is the claim, because false light cares less about whether there's a direct falsity of the statement. What they care about is, did this cast him in a misleading or unfair way? It's got a bit of a more amorphous feel to it, and it's not only looking to reputational harm, it's looking to, is this embarrassing to PewDiePie? I think certainly this was an embarrassing episode for him. You still got a high reckless disregard standard for putting those images together.
But you remember what happened last time was that PewDiePie paid somebody to hold up a sign that said "Death to all Jews," awful thing, whatever. But PewDiePie said, "Look, I was just testing the limits of what these guys would hold up as a sign. I was doing it more of as a social experiment than anything else. It's not my views." The Wall Street Journal had that information. They knew the context, and they decided to omit that context, and therefore they acted recklessly and brought me into disrepute. Sure, it was technically true, and therefore it's not defamatory, but did it cast me in a misleading light? I think it did.
Yeah, I think that kind of claim actually could survive a motion to dismiss. That becomes a factual issue. I think on its face, all of the elements could be satisfied by PewDiePie, and he gets a lot of leverage if he brings a false light claim in that context, don't you think?
I think he should hire us to bring that claim against the Journal.
I'm licking my chops, man.
Are you
all
really?
of a sudden, I want to represent PewDiePie.
What's our fee?
Oh boy, we can negotiate.
All right, next one up is from Daniel McDonald. Is the recent fear of constitutional originalism by progressives and various news outlets well-founded, or is it merely a backlash to Donald Trump being given, or what is perceived to be, by many, a stolen Supreme Court nomination?
The sound of podcasts being clicked off everywhere.
Do you have a fear of originalism? I don't think it's something that I'm fearful of.
I have a bit of a fear of originalism. You know, this concept that we should interpret the Constitution as it was originally drafted and in the eyes of the original drafters. I have a bit of a fear because I think it's intellectually not necessarily the most salient way to go about interpreting the Constitution.
Yeah, look, I think there's a balance, right? You don't want a document that isn't actually sort of a law that is fixed in some way, because that would be untethered. We have sound traditions here that we should show some fidelity to, but it's built into the Constitution that you interpret it. I mean, these things were drafted in such a way that they're begging for interpretation. I think of like the 9th Amendment. It talks about penumbras of rights. I mean, those rights are by definition not defined, and they were to be defined by future generations.
And let's not forget who the Founding Fathers were. They were all white. They were all Christian or atheists or Christian. There was no sort of diversity of religious views, and they were all I said men, white, all Christian, and it's tough to apply their philosophies with a broad stroke to today's population.
These are the same guys who had a 3/5 compromise for
slavery.
Black individuals.
Right. So, so we have to look at it through that lens. And I just think the Constitution is purposefully very vague in some areas. The problem with originalism is that I don't think that even the Founding Fathers meant for the Constitution to be interpreted in a static way for however long the Union lasts. I think there was some acknowledgement in the way it was drafted that subsequent generations would interpret it in their own way.
I think that's right.
And that is it for Mail Time.
Thanks everybody for tuning into the podcast. We will be back again next week with another, and next week's going to be awesome. This one was fantastic. Next week, really
don't diminish this. This was wonderful.
It's great. Thanks so much again. Take out your phone, subscribe to go to the podcast store, find TMZ Behind the Bar, and subscribe. It helps us a lot.
Send in those questions. We love them.
Send in the questions and check us out on YouTube.
Hey, in addition to subscribing, don't forget to rate us and write reviews of our podcast. It really helps us out a lot.
I'm so glad you brought that up. It's easy for you to say. I always forget to mention that. It helps to elevate our podcast within the podcast store. And
we're also generally desperate for your feedback. We'd love to hear about how handsome I am, things like that.
We're desperate for your positive feedback.
Yeah, keep it positive.
Let's go. But yeah, so
5 stars and above.
So head to the podcast store, download the podcast, subscribe to the podcast, and rate the podcast with 5 lovely stars. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks for watching. If you want more nerdy deep dives into the legal side of celebrity news, hit our subscribe button right here.
And check out our previous episode over here.